Story 1. I was 16 and bought a beater for less than $300. It needed a lot of work, but I was fairly competent at car repair, so I was able to keep it running for a couple of years. Story 2. At 15, I bought a Datsun B210 for $100. It had no padding on the seats and sat on springs. It used a quart of oil a day, but oil cost 25 cents a quart. I had saved every cent I had. Delivering papers on a friend's route paid for it. Story 3. I am a 75-year-old man. When I was 24, in 1974, I bought a 1973 Chevrolet Malibu. It was a low-mileage repossession by a bank, with not even 9,000 miles on it yet. I made a down payment and financed the rest with a bank. Why no car until age 24? I did not need one. I joined the Navy in 1968 and did not need a car for any of my duty assignments until I got married. Until then, I could get anywhere I needed to go by public transportation, walking, or a 10-speed bicycle. I was not, and never have been, a motorhead. I never thought of a car as a status symbol. I did not get one until I actually needed it. Story 4. I was 18 and bought a brand new car. You could do that on minimum wage before Reagan caused the Republican Party to stop caring about people. Story 5. I was 19 and a university student. My father bought the car, paid for servicing and insurance, and I paid for fuel. My parents were busy professionals, and my younger siblings needed to be driven to many extracurricular activities. I received the car in exchange for taking over driving duties and running errands, which took a huge load off my parents and freed up their afternoons and evenings. If one of my parents' vehicles broke down or was being serviced, my car was available to them until theirs was usable again. Although my father paid for the car, it came with conditions that I gladly accepted. Story 6. It was a Honda CR-V. I think it was a 2011 or 2012 model. The color was red. My girlfriend's father at the time found it on Facebook Marketplace and thought it was a good deal. I think it cost around $7,000. My parents paid for it with the promise that I would always drive and run errands, which I agreed to and followed through on. Story 7. When I was 17, I chose an original black Ford Puma. I worked every hour God sent at Coe's. Story 8. 2008 Honda Fit. It was inexpensive, purchased with my Doctor of Philosophy salary. I loved the car. Story 9. 2008 Toyota RAV4. I bought it when I was 30 years old because I was driving a Volkswagen Polo that had been handed down to me by my mother, who had bought a newer car 10 years earlier. The Toyota was the first car I purchased. At that time, I had the money saved from my wages. Story 10. When I was 18, I worked at a Subway restaurant near my parents' house. It was close enough to walk, and I saved enough to buy a purple Toyota Corolla. Story 11. I was 17. I paid $50 for it, even though it was not running. It was a 1971 Plymouth Duster. I got a real education from that car. Story 12. I bought an operable 1998 Honda Civic Deluxe when I was 16 for $750. I worked for a month. Story 13. I bought a used car from my parents. I knew its history and the price was good. I was 19 or 20 years old. Story 14. I never wanted or needed one. I got a motorcycle when I was 28, though. Story 15. In my mid-20s, I saved for a down payment from my first job after college. I paid $10,000 toward a purchase that cost about $20,000. Before that, I carpooled and used public transportation. Story 16. When I was 16, I bought my mom's Jeep. I had been saving money since I was 13, when I started detailing boats. Story 17. I think I was 16 or 17. I bought my first car, paid it off, and a week later someone crashed into it. Story 18. I was lucky that my parents gave me their Volvo station wagon. I bought my first car at 25 and they had to co-sign for it because I had no credit. I was a bartender at the time, so that's how I was able to afford it. Story 19. My mother bought me a pristine 1991 Accord in 2006 for $1,200. It was a great used car that cost almost nothing. Those days are gone. After that, I bought a series of junker sports cars from my college summer earnings and from various internships and odd jobs. A 1993 100ZX and a 2001 Miata. There were so many great cars under $5,000 back in my day. Story 20. I was 23 and had worked full-time on and off since I was 18. I had saved up but still lived with my parents, so I did not have any expenses. It was a lot easier back then thanks to them. Story 21. I was 17. I worked all summer at a crappy ice cream stand making $9 per hour and bought the ugliest old Saturn you have ever seen. It barely ran, but it gave me independence, and that was all I cared about. Story 22. At 16, I was lucky to get the family car my older siblings had driven. The car was 10 years old at the time. I drove it for 5 years. At 21, my parents and grandparents each contributed $2,000 and bought me a $6,000 6-year-old Honda Civic base model with manual transmission, manual windows, and manual locks. I probably changed the oil once a year. It was great. I drove it for 8 years. At 29, I purchased my first vehicle, a brand new Honda CBR 600RR motorcycle. It was a slow market, and I think I paid around $9,000. I was able to afford it because I was established in a career by then. At 30, I purchased a 1964 Chevrolet C10. I sold it a few years later for $2,000. It was a poor truck in many ways, but it ran well. I really regret selling it. At 31, I purchased my first brand new car, and probably the last new car I will ever buy. It was a Nissan Rogue. I wanted a compact SUV and test drove about 7 different models. I paid with income from a stable job and financed it through the dealer for 60 months at 0.99% interest. I miss those days. Story 23. I was 27. I had been working full-time for 5 years and had saved up. Before that, I used old cars from my parents. My dad was great at keeping them running, probably longer than he should have. Story 24. I was 18 when I took out a loan to buy a $750 rusty 12-year-old sedan. The interior was nasty with spills on the seats and carpet. I removed the seats and carpet, scrubbed everything, and my dad power washed the carpet at his shop. After putting it back together, it looked fairly nice. It lasted only a couple of years before rust threatened the rear suspension, so I sold it for about the same price I had paid. Story 25. I bought my first car at 27 for $500. I worked full-time and saved my money. Cars were cheaper then. Story 26. I am 45 and I have never bought a car. Hiring cars when I need them is cheaper for me, and I have a bike for everything else. Story 27. 1904 Rolls-Royce 10 horsepower 2-seater. I started a company at midnight when I turned 18, even though I was born at 11:53 in the evening. I made $20 million. Story 28. At 17 in 2006, I bought a 5-year-old Toyota Camry, model year 2001. My parents purchased it, but I paid 100% of the car payments from my full-time job at a grocery store while attending school. I kept that car for about 9 years, then bought a new Honda Accord in 2015, which I still have 10 years later. Story 29. I bought a Chevrolet Beretta for $400. Back then, used cars could be found for a few $100s, often under $1,000 for a decent car. I cleaned gutters, shoveled snow, and cut grass and saved up. Unfortunately, I never registered the car and only got scrap value for it because my brother and his friends drove their trucks over it. He also bought me a 1984 Ford F-150 when I got my license. Story 30. I bought a Volkswagen convertible for $1,000 that needed to be restored. I got a loan and paid $100 a month. My dad thought I was crazy for buying what he called a junker. 6 months later, I was entering it in car shows. My dad paid for the convertible top replacement. Story 31. When I was 16, my parents told me they would match what I saved for a new car. I saved $3,000. Story 32. At 17, I had saved every penny for mowing, snow shoveling, and working 10 hours every weekend from age 12 at a family member's business. I paid cash in full for a new truck. Story 33. I worked at a grocery store from the time I was eligible. I bought the car at 17 after getting my driver's license. It definitely beat riding a bicycle to work. Story 34. In 2008, I bought a Chevrolet Aveo for $2,300 after 6 months of work at my part-time job. I still miss that piece of garbage. It got me through college. Story 35. I was 22. I had started a new job a few years earlier. After my 90-day probation period, we went on strike and the company illegally fired us. A year and a half later, the union got our jobs back with back pay. I used that check to buy my first car. Story 36. I was 17. I had a part-time job in high school and bought a beater Volkswagen Beetle for $500. My dad paid for the insurance. Story 37. I bought a 1993 Plymouth Sundance with a couple $1,000s down and took out a loan from my credit union. Story 38. I was 16 and bought a 1976 Hornet in 1985 for $300 from working a paper route. We later learned it rarely went into reverse, which made driving friends around interesting. After I had it for a year, a Mustang lost control on the highway and hit me head-on, forcing my car into an unrecoverable spin. My car came to rest under a camper at a recreational vehicle dealer by the road. I probably used up most of my luck in that moment. I walked away with some pain and glass in my eyes and nose, but I used the insurance money to buy a 1979 Mustang for $1,400. When the tow truck pulled my car out, my dad said they had to pull it out the same way it had gone in, between an oak tree and a telephone pole. My car somehow missed both. There was only about 6 to 10 inches on each side. The tow truck driver shook his head, wondering how I survived. That Mustang later proved to be a disappointment because of its problems. At least it could go into reverse. Story 39. My first car was a pickup truck that I got when I was 14. I didn't even have a driver's license, and it wasn't legal nor was I allowed to drive on the road. I did anyway. I earned the money by bottle feeding calves. The way that worked was you went to the county auction where you could buy dairy bulls or dairy heifers. The bulls were raised for beef. Typically, I would buy the bulls and raise them, and then slaughterhouses would buy them for beef at 15 to 24 months of age. The good quality dairy heifers you could take straight back to the auction after they were weaned, usually between 2 weeks and a month. It was not a great way to make money, but for a teenage farm boy it was enough to buy my first car. Story 40. At 29, I had put off getting my driver's license for ages. I had a few thousand saved up and was going to get an older car, but my family had a different idea and got me a lightly used 2018 Volkswagen Up. I ended up not driving much and transferred the car to my grandfather, who still drives but needed a smaller vehicle. Story 41. At 16, I got a job at the car wash to buy a 1991 LeBaron for my mom for $500. It was maroon and not a convertible. Story 42. I was 17 and owned a 2000 Toyota Avalon. I had been working for 4 years at that point. Story 43. I was 24 years old when I bought a 2016 Toyota Corolla in 2019, and I still own it today. Story 44. At 19, I worked full-time at Walmart and saved every penny. I ended up buying a 2003 Oldsmobile Alero in 2012 for 3,400 Canadian dollars. It was in good shape, had low mileage, and was certified. I drove it for 8 years until the steering rack literally fell off while I was driving. Story 45. I bought a 2011 Jeep Patriot by working and saving money on the side. Story 46. I paid $6,000 for a 1979 Camaro. I put down $1,300 as a down payment. My payment was $152 a month for 3 years at 8%. I was 19. Story 47. I was 22 when my parents paid 57% of it, and I paid the rest with money I had saved during college. Story 48. I was 16 in 2003. It was a 1983 Ford sedan I bought from my pop's elderly neighbor. It had belonged to her husband, who had died months earlier. He had been a mechanic and loved the car. I paid $3,500 for it. It lasted until I bought my first brand new car, a 2012 Mazda 3, which I still have today. Story 49. Around 1997, I was 18 or 19. I bought a used Jetta from a private seller. I do not remember the price, but it could not have been more than a couple of $1,000s. I saved up and paid cash. Story 50. I was 16 and bought a 13-year-old Nissan 240SX for $1,800 from a private seller. 1.5 years earlier, I had gotten a job making minimum wage and saved everything I could to buy a car. I either got rides from family or friends or rode my bike to work. After I bought the car, I ended up putting easily another $1,000 into it over the first 6 months. This was one of the best things I ever did at that age. I set a goal, worked for it, and accomplished it. It was not the greatest car on the road, but it was mine, and it felt good to know I had earned it. I missed that car. Story 51. I was 17. It was a 1985 Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme with 190,000 miles. I paid $1,000 for it in 2001. I had a job and my parents promised to match what I saved. I saved $800, but my parents paid half. I missed that car. It was a pile of dog shit, but it never left me stranded and always got me where I needed to go. Adam Sandler made a song about the car that was damn accurate. Story 52. I worked full-time at Atwood Printing Company all summer. During my senior year, I worked after school at Big Jim's Chuckwagon restaurant and mowed lawns, pulled weeds, and raked leaves. I saved every penny I could, finally borrowed $50 from my mom, and paid cash for a 9-year-old car. I was 17. Story 53. I was 16. My parents bought me a 6-year-old used car, and I paid them monthly. I had been sharing a car with my dad, but our work schedules sometimes conflicted, so they decided it was time I got my own. Obviously, a bank was not going to give a loan to a 16-year-old, so my parents acted as the bank. Story 54. I was 17. My mom knew a retired man who had a dealer's license. He took me to an auction only for dealers and helped me pick out a clunker in my price range that would not require too much work. I ended up paying $500 for it. I could afford it because my parents had made me save half of my take-home pay my whole life, so my savings were decent. It was a blue Dodge Aries station wagon. Story 55. I was 17 or 18 when I bought my own car with money I earned from working. I did not finance a car until I was about 21, when I had my first grown-up job in the Army for a couple of years. Story 56. It was 1978. I was 18 and it cost $1,200. I had worked a part-time job as a dishwasher for a year and a half. I paid for my gas and my dad covered my insurance. Story 57. A 2001 325i from Bavarian Motor Works, silver. I found it on Craigslist in Austin after I got my license in 2009. Listed for $4,500, it was a single-owner car owned by an elderly woman who could no longer drive. My dad took me to her house and we test drove it. He negotiated the price down to $4,000. It was my entire savings. My parents gave me $100 for my report cards in high school if I made straight A's, and an extra $100 if I made 100 in one of the 4 core classes. That was where about half of it came from, saved up from freshman year. The other half was from working hourly as a welder for a friend of my dad. He paid me $10 an hour to weld clips onto I-beams at his shop. It was an easy part of their prefabrication process. This income was not documented because I was too young for a job, so it was paid in cash. Story 58. When I was 22, I paid 1,500 euros for a Peugeot 206 after about a year of saving. I worked in a storage facility about 12 hours a day for 300 euros per month and saved up to buy it. One perk of the job was that I stayed thin and fit because I could not afford much food. I did heavy lifting all the time, and I walked about 8 kilometers to work every day. Sometimes my boss invited me to lunch and paid, but I earned less when I went because I worked fewer hours. Story 59. I was 16 and earned $500. I worked the summer cutting firewood. I had a 1951 Ford pickup. Story 60. I bought an old Saturn for my parents for Blue Book value using the money I had earned from summer jobs over the previous couple of years. I was about 20. My parents let me stay on their insurance until I graduated from college, which helped. Story 61. When I was 16, my cousin gave me a Mazda 323. Story 62. My first car was my grandfather's. When he died, I got it for $1 because I had just turned 16. The first car I bought myself was a used Nissan Altima for about $10,000, and I financed it entirely with a loan. Story 63. I was 15. I had mowed lawns all summer when I was 14 and most of the summer when I was 15, and I paid $750 for a beat-up 1992 bluish-green Honda Civic with working air conditioning. Its top speed depended on wind direction and how many passengers it carried. Story 64. I was 17 because it took me 5 attempts to pass the road test. A close friend of my grandparents had recently moved into a retirement home and did not need his car anymore. He offered to let me have it for $200. Story 65. I was a few weeks shy of turning 16 when my parents said they would buy me a vehicle worth $3,000 or less. When they upgraded theirs, they gave the old one to my brother, and it had been valued at $3,000 at the time. I wanted a pickup, but the only $3,000 trucks in my area were worn-out, beat-up farm trucks. My mother kept an eye out and found a really nice one for $6,000, so they bought it for me. I paid them the difference and finished paying them on the day I graduated from high school. They also tried to give me my father's old pickup, but I did not like it and did not feel safe going over 55 miles per hour in it. My father bought a newer pickup shortly after they bought mine. A week after he sold the one they had offered me, its engine blew up. Story 66. I was 18. In 2008, I bought a 2000 Dodge Intrepid with only 39,000 miles. I got a loan with my dad as the co-signer and paid it off 6 months early. 2 months after I paid it off, I lost my job and the engine blew up. That was my first major setback in life. I missed that car. Story 67. I just bought my first new car ever at 41. I had my mother's old car before. A couple of years after I moved in with my ex, he wanted a new car and bought one. We only had one parking spot, so I sold mine. I was recently dumped and needed a car fast. So my first new car is a 2025 Toyota Corolla Sport Edition. It was a take it or wait 9 to 12 months situation, and I could not wait. My mother was able to help me buy it, and I owe very little on it because of my late father's life insurance. Story 68. When I was 17, I bought a 1999 Toyota Camry from an 80-year-old woman for $700. Story 69. I am 29 years old, have been working for almost 7 years, and saved up some money. At that time, the government had a tax exemption policy and was issuing licenses for free, so I bought this car. Story 70. I was 15, and my dad bought it for me for $900 in 2007. It was a 1997 Nissan Sentra. I could have bought it myself, but I needed a car to start working, and he wanted me to save for college. Story 71. I was 17 or 18 when I bought a motorcycle. It was the first vehicle I had ever purchased with my own money. The motorcycle was used. I bought my first car with my own money when I was 25. My wife and I had just had a baby who spent weeks in the neonatal intensive care unit. We only had one car at the time, which was a 2-door. Right before our baby was supposed to come home, I tried to install the car seat in the back and found that I could not move the front seat back while the car seat was installed. So we went out and bought a new car. We both had jobs, so we used our income to afford the payments. Story 72. It was the summer between my 2 years of graduate school, and I had made about $80,000 over the previous year playing cards online. I paid off my only private high-interest student loan and bought the car. Then the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act was tacked on as a rider to a port security bill, and the party was over. Story 73. I was 17 and bought my brother's old car for $500. It needed about $1,000 of repairs. My brother was a mechanic at the time and he fixed it up. I had 2 part-time jobs and basically no expenses other than gas in the car. I lived at home, which was 45 minutes from town, so I had an almost 1-hour daily commute to college and to my jobs. I had the car for just over a year. Then I had an accident. I rear-ended someone. The damage was too much to fix. That car could have lasted another few years. It had very little rust and, after repairs, the engine ran perfectly. It had nearly 300,000 kilometers on it. Now that I think about it, it did have an oil leak from the oil pan gasket. I recall my girlfriend's dad was upset when I parked in their laneway and it dripped oil on his interlock device. So he asked that I park in the street. Story 74. When I was 21, after I graduated from college and received my first paycheck, I bought my first car. It was a 5-year-old SUV and I financed it. Cost $10,000. This was a high-end used car at the time, but that was okay because I had a permanent job with one of the best employers in the state. Unfortunately, they were bought out 6 months later. Story 75. I bought a used 1987 manual transmission Volkswagen Fox in 1990. My parents probably paid most of it, but I had to keep my grades up to stay on their insurance. I put a lot of miles on it and beat it up in just 5 years. Story 76. I was 16 and bought a used car for, I think, around $750. Many kids worked in the 1960s and 1970s. Story 77. At 15, I had a summer part-time job. I bought a 1971 Volkswagen Beetle for $700. It lasted 3 weeks before I was rear-ended by an ambulance. Story 78. After I passed my test, my elderly grandfather offered to sell me his car for £1. Story 79. A 1997 Jeep Wrangler. My dad bought it at a police auction for $4,000. It had hardly any miles and was basically brand new. I paid him back over 2 years. Story 80. When I was 15, I started getting excited for my 16th birthday because I knew I would take the driver's test that day. I started saving some money from a few lawn mowing jobs. A coworker of my father was selling his 1988 Burgundy Chevrolet Cavalier station wagon with both interior and exterior included. I bought it for $400. We completed the safety inspection at home with my father. I used it for about a year, which was nearly 10,000 miles. For a 10th grader, I drove my friends and myself everywhere and rarely had to put gas in it. I often paid for gas in coins, about $2.50 each time, between school, my house, and my friends' places. Gas was closer to $1.50 per gallon back then. Story 81. I was 21 when I bought a 1977 Mercury Marquis for $100. I had worked summer jobs since I was 15, so I could afford it. I got it cheap because the owner, one of my dad's bosses, had been offered only $100 for it as a trade-in. Story 82. At 26, I got a job that required a car, so I went shopping. It was fall, and the end of model year sales helped me get a new car they were trying to clear out for the new models. My mom helped by co-signing. Story 83. At 16, I bought an old Ford Fairlane 500 for $50 and drove it back and forth to school during my junior and senior years. I sold it for $100 before leaving for college. Story 84. I am 33 and have never owned a car. Let us hope and aim to keep it that way. Story 85. In 1970, when I was 16, my parents let me buy a motorcycle with money I earned as an after-school dishwasher. Around the same time, 3 of my friends also bought motorcycles, so we each had a new Honda 350. We lived in Southern California and rode everywhere together. That summer was magical. We rode to the beach about 3 days a week. From the start of our senior year until Christmas break, all 3 of my friends were in accidents on their bikes, one of them very serious. To Christmas, my parents told me that if I got rid of the bike, they would buy me a brand new Volkswagen Beetle. I got a red one. Story 86. I bought a 1982 Honda Prelude for $800. My parents co-signed the loan. It was not a large amount, but I convinced them it would be a good way to build my credit. I was 15 years old. Story 87. At 16, I got my first car from my older brother for $1,000. I have been working since age 14. Now, at age 26, my third car is paid off and it is finally mine. Story 88. Bambi's mom decided she did not like the car my parents gave me, their old car, and totaled it. The insurance payout covered a different car. Story 89. At 21, I co-signed on a used Honda with my dad and paid it off while working as a bartender in college. If that doesn't count, I bought a brand new car in 2021 when the market was very favorable and paid it off with my full-time job. Story 90. I was 21 when I bought the cheapest car I could find with my first salary of €1,500 in 2016. Story 91. I bought a Chevrolet S10 from my parents for $2,800. They gave me a loan and I repaid them $400 per month until it was paid off. When I got my driver's license, I had to get a job to drive. I worked as a dishwasher at a restaurant and then as a package handler at Federal Express. Now I have my first car with under 50,000 miles and I love it. I graduated from college and obtained a great job that I enjoy. Story 92. I bought a car for the first time when I was 25. It was a new Mitsubishi Evo X that cost approximately $40,000. I had started a job out of college that paid about $40,000 a year, and I saved until I could afford the car plus about $10,000 in modifications. Story 93. It was $200. Affording it was not a problem because I always worked summer jobs, mowed lawns, shoveled sidewalks, and so on. Story 94. The one I actually paid for myself was my 2013 Ford Edge. I was 28. My wife had a job and I was about to start residency, so I had an income. I had 2 cars before that, which my mom bought for me. Story 95. I was 18 in 1995. My car was a 1987 Chevette scooter, a small hatchback. It cost me $500 and probably should never have been allowed on the road. Story 96. I was 17 and had a job. I bought a Chevrolet S10 from a coworker for about $800. Story 97. When I was 16, it was $600, but I had to fix it. I learned a lot from that. Now I make good money as a mechanic. Story 98. It was about $1,500 in the late 1990s. I paid half and my mom paid the other half. I could have paid the whole amount, but she offered so I would not spend all my money. Or it was a good deal we did not want to miss, so she paid the rest. I do not remember the details, but I paid her back quickly. Story 99. I was 20 and in the military. In 2012, I bought a 2006 Honda Civic. I took out a 5-year loan and paid it off in 3 years. Story 100. My dad got me a 2007 Mercedes E350 for $5,000 when I turned 16. I was grateful and loved the car, but I could not afford maintenance costs, so I had to learn to work on it myself. We had agreed I would make payments for half the car's value over time, but my dad stopped taking it seriously after I paid $1,500. Eventually, the car mechanically failed and I sold it for $2,000 3 years after I got it. Story 101. At 14, I saved money from working so I could have it ready by the next year when I got my license. Story 102. In 2014, I was 20 years old and I bought a 1999 Honda Prelude. It had a salvage title but sustained only rear body damage. The engine, suspension, and interior were in great shape. It had 45,000 miles on it. I worked a campus job for a year and took a 0% loan from my dad to cover the last $600. It was so worth it. God, I missed that car. Story 103. I had a car that my grandmother bought me for my high school graduation in 1985, a used 1983 Toyota Tercel. It was totaled in an accident when I was 22. I took the insurance money and used it as a down payment on a 1988 Chevrolet Beretta, which I paid for over time. I have had 12 cars in my life so far. I am 58. I like having newer cars, so I usually have a car payment. I currently drive a 2025 Ford Mustang Mach-E. Story 104. When I was 23, I received a loan that paid for my car and insurance. I never paid it back. Story 105. I paid for it all, but my parents co-signed the loan because I did not have any financial history. I had a job and the payment was $200 a month, so working full-time was not a problem. Story 106. I was 16, 2 weeks before my 17th birthday. I saved money from working and used some old defense bonds from my grandparents, members of the greatest generation. I bought a 1997 convertible in 2001. Story 107. My first car was a hand-me-down from my brother when I was 18, although I gave him $3,000 from my student aid. Story 108. I was 18 and needed a car so I could cut my travel time. Buses took me 1 to 1.5 hours to get where I needed to go. So I bought a 1988 Dodge Dakota for $1,500. I had already been working since I was 12 every summer, so I had money saved up. My commute dropped to 15 minutes, and it was worth it. Story 109. I was 19. I bought it with a loan from my work credit union. I paid it through monthly deductions from my paycheck. It cost $72 a month for 3 years. It was a 1972 Datsun, brand new. Story 110. I had a job long enough to save up for it and bought a mid-range car that was 7 years old. It was and remains the most expensive thing I have bought, but was not a bank-breaking purchase. When I was 19, my parents bought me a second-hand car, which I drove until I was 26, when it went to my sister. I was carless in between but often borrowed one of my parents' cars. I was bouncing between 3 countries separated by the sea, so a car of my own was not very practical. Story 111. I was 19 and a half in 1984. I paid for my first car with a bank loan and remember getting a grilling from the bank manager. It was an Austin Allegro that went from 0 to 60 in 29.3 seconds. Funny how that time stuck with me. I had never driven anything so slow. I hated it and could not wait to get rid of it. But it was my first car and it got me places. 2 years later, after I had paid off the loan, my conversation with the bank manager went like this. I'd like to borrow some money to change my car. How much do you want to borrow? £1,200, please. I have saved up the other £1,200. Okay then, not a problem. The days before credit ratings. Story 112. My parents bought my brother's old car for my 18th birthday. I had it as soon as I passed my test at 17. Story 113. I sold a cow and did yard work. I beat the hell out of that 1992 Sonoma and it kept running. The 4.3-liter engine is one of the toughest engines I have come across. Story 114. When I was 15 and a half, I started working at 14 and saved up to buy it from my brother for $5,000. Story 115. I took a loan from my parents. I had money for a down payment, and with each paycheck I paid them back. Felt so good to clear that debt. Story 116. I was 16 and it was free. The owner did not want it anymore. He could not sell it. It was not worth enough for scrap dealers to bother with. He was glad to be rid of it, and I was too when I finally managed to ditch it. Story 117. I was 24. We bought an old car from my future sister-in-law for $2,000. Story 118. At 25, I considered myself a tree hugger, so I avoided the idea of owning a car. A friend told me I was a hypocrite with this mindset, given I took the bus to my full-time job and that I was not really making a dent in preserving the environment. He also joked that men my age have more sex if they have a car, laughing out loud. I bought my first car, a 2001 Nissan Pathfinder, for $3,000. I missed that four-wheel drive powerhouse. Story 119. It was 1985 and I was about to get my driver's license. My grandparents had just moved into a senior living community and no longer needed their car, a 1980 Pontiac Sunbird. They were very gracious and sold it to me for $1. I drove that car into the ground until 1991 after putting over 120,000 miles on it. Story 120. It was a hand-me-down from my grandmother who was giving up driving. I bought it for $1. I drove that truck until I could not justify putting $3,300 of maintenance into it. Story 121. At 17 I paid $400 in 2006 for a 1990 Jeep Cherokee, which I bought with money I earned at my first retail job. Story 122. 32 military Dodge Charger should explain everything. Story 123. When I was 26 and studying for a Doctor of Philosophy degree, I bought a Bayerische Motorenwerke vehicle. It was the first time I had lived far enough away from my parents that they did not let me take one of their cars because they lived on the other side of the country. I had finished my undergraduate degree and my master's degree with money saved and no debt because my cooperative jobs paid very well, and my parents also gave me some money. The car is now 12 years old and is starting to show its age. I am planning to get a new one in the next couple of years, but I love the car and do not want to get rid of it. Story 124. I was 18. I bought a Rambler beater for $200, which is $1,760 in today's dollars, to commute to junior college. I had a part-time job repairing televisions and did additional repairs on the side. Story 125. I was 20 years old in 2020 when I bought a used Ford Fusion Hybrid for $20,000 with a $1,000 down payment. At the time, rebate rules for hybrid vehicles were less strict, so it was a good first car. My interest rate was 5% and my payment was $320 a month. I had it halfway paid off when I totaled it 6 months later during a snowstorm. I worked as a manager at Taco Bell, earning about $500 a week. I lived at home and paid only for internet, electricity, my own food, and my phone bill. Story 126. I bought a car with my own money at age 29. I had been saving since I started working and felt it was time to sell my old car. I bought a 2019 Honda Civic C, my attainable dream car. It was a certified pre-owned vehicle at a Honda dealer with fewer than 8,000 miles. The selling price was a bit under $22,000 in January 2021, during the coronavirus disease 2019 pandemic, right before used car prices rose. Story 127. In 1993, I bought a 1983 Toyota Cressida for $1,000. I had sold my hand-me-down 1980 Toyota pickup for $700 and used my savings for the rest. It was an excellent car, and I got a great deal because the owner did not need it anymore. Story 128. To be honest, my first vehicle was a shared family car. Shortly after, I purchased my own for $500 at the age of 16. It was a bright red, although faded and a little rusty, 1968 Chevelle with a 307 cubic inch engine and a 3-on-the-tree transmission. It had glass-packed dual exhaust, snow tires, and a battery chained and locked under the hood. It was a lousy car and the best thing I had owned up to that point. I worked at a local grocery store during high school. I started as a bagger and was promoted to produce clerk. My starting wage was 25 cents over minimum wage to help quiet the union protesters, and I received raises every 3 months. I worked hard to earn the money and still stay in school. Story 129. I was 18 when I bought my first brand new car. It only had 4 miles on it. I was working at a pretty decent job and lived with my parents, so I did not have too many other expenses. Story 130. I was 16 and sold iBooks on eBay. I bought a 25th anniversary 5.0 Fox Body Mustang from a friend who had to pay off a speeding ticket. I spent $300 on it. He never paid the ticket and instead spent the money on Jordans. I had the car for about 2 years until I tried to change the exhaust to something less obnoxious and broke half the bolts off. Story 131. I was 14 and worked at McDonald's, saving up all my money to buy an old beater. I live in a state that allows you to get your license 6 months after you get your permit if you complete a driver's education course. Story 132. At 18, I bought a 2002 Peugeot 306 with all the money I had in my bank account, which my parents had put there, €1,200. It was a great car for the time and as a first car. I sold it 6 years later without a single issue. I never bought another one. I am still car-free 9 years later, but I am looking to buy a car now because I moved far from the city. Story 133. I bought it from my nan when I was 17. I had saved some money, and she sold it to me for whatever I had. I was very fortunate. Story 134. I bought a 2000 Vauxhall Corsa in 2005 when I was 16 for £1,600. I had the money because I was in a minor car crash at age 11 and received £1,750 in compensation. My mum saved that money until I was ready to buy a car. Story 135. I was 42 and paid for it by working full-time for over 20 years without ever buying a car. Story 136. At age 16, I bought a 2002 Honda Civic Deluxe with a manual transmission. My grandparents had opened a small trust when I was born, and I used funds from that trust to buy the car. I paid for college by working full-time. Over the following years, I overspent on credit cards and car modifications and eventually had to consolidate my debt. I learned a very important lesson during that time. Since then, I have had a passion for personal finance. Story 137. I was 23 and bought a Renault Scenic. I was single and had no family. The salesman laughed at me the entire time, but I had 21,500 euros saved from summer jobs, and that was what I wanted to spend on a car. It was the biggest I could get for that price at the time. I loved it every minute. Story 138. Technically, I got my first car at 18 when my uncle died. I had just started university, considered the cost, and said no, so I gave it to my younger brother, who also had a license. Then, when I was around 22 or 23 and had my first job after university, I bought a car myself with money I had saved during an internship in my third year that I had been slowly using up, laughing out loud. Story 139. At 17, I could afford it because I paid £40. It came with 6 months tax and half a tank of fuel. For the next car, I paid £80 because the owner had been told it was scrap. I spent an afternoon fixing what I suspected was wrong with the engine, then drove it for 250,000 miles before selling it to a man who wanted a basic old car for use in London. Story 140. I was 18 and in the military. I bought a used Honda Accord. I was earning about $9,000 a year back then. Story 141. 1984 Austin Montego 1.3, 250 pounds. I bought it with money I earned from my part-time job in 1996. It was a big help for getting to and from college. It was extremely easy to service. It never went wrong. The engine design was simple and had been around for years. Parts were widely available, and it had the best legroom of any first car available at the time. Story 142. I was 17 when I bought a 2000 Toyota 4Runner for $3,500 from a family friend on a payment plan. It now has a salvage title, but she gave me 5 beautiful years with no issues. I am saving up to fix her. Story 143. I was 17 years old in 2004 and drove a 2001 Dodge Dakota, a higher-end trim, with a 4.7-liter Mercedes 8-cylinder V engine. It had a standard body and a metric engine, and I had to use my entire rollaway tool chest to change the power steering pump. I bought it at a public auction for $6,500 when it was worth about $18,000. It had a dent in the right rear quarter panel. I recommend public auctions, but you need cash in hand or a bank-certified check. At the time, I was working construction on weekends and summers, making $15 an hour while the minimum wage was about $6. I also recommend working in the trades, especially if you do not yet know what you want to do. Story 144. I got a job and worked for it. I was also saving for college. Story 145. I bought my first car at age 15. While working at a gas station, I saved up $1,500 and paid cash. This is the way. I have been doing it ever since. If I cannot pay cash, I cannot afford it. Story 146. For my first car, I saved $10,000, and my grandparents matched my savings, so I bought a Chevrolet Trax for $20,000. I hit a deer and it was written off. I then bought a Toyota Camry for $25,000 with additional help from my grandparents. Later, I was gifted a Suzuki and traded in the Camry for a Ford Mustang Grand Touring for $45,000. I spent $90,000 in 3 years on my first car. Respect and appreciate your family, and good things will happen. Story 147. I was 16 and bought a cheap Audi for about $4,000. I started working at local restaurants and doing odd jobs at 12 and saved my money. Things were different years ago than they are today. I am not sure any employer would hire you at that age now. Story 148. A Renault 4 bought with obsolete currency. The euro replaced the national currency, and I have no idea how much it was. I worked 2 summers at a hotel and earned $3 million of that currency. I was 18 years old. That car took me places and was a huge success with girls. Not everyone had a car in university back then. Story 149. I was 22. I worked for it and got a job right after high school. I bought a car for my dad. It's under his name, but since I bought it for him, I count it as mine. One evening, while I was eating dinner, my parents came to me and asked for money to help my dad buy a car. He was in an accident. He was fine, but the car was not, and the accident was not his fault. I agreed and gave them the money. Story 150. I was 16 and had a full-time job at the Greyhound bus company. I bought a used Toyota Celica. I had saved $1,700, and my dad arranged a loan at his credit union for the remaining balance of approximately $1,800. I paid $20 a week for about 2 years. Story 151. I think I was 21. It was a 1970 Ford Limited, so it was only $700. Story 152. I bought my first used car at age 19 after driving my parents' hand-me-down Ford Pinto station wagon for 3 years. It had hidden flood damage and needed replacing within 12 months. I bought a new 1990 Ford Festiva just before my 21st birthday, later passed it to my sister when she needed a car, and then bought a 1993 Mazda Protege. I bought the used car on my own for $3,000, paid $500 down, and took a loan for the rest. For the Festiva, my dad, who loved haggling with car salespeople, got the dealer to buy the old car for $2,000. It had burned most or all of the engine oil by the time we got it to the dealer, so it was not smoking while running. The manufacturer's suggested retail price was about $7,000, but my dad negotiated the purchase price down to just under $5,000, which I financed. My parents gave me $3,000 for the Festiva so my sister could take it, and I used that plus a small portion of my inheritance from my grandmother as the down payment for the Protege and financed the remainder. Story 153. In 1994, I had a red Camaro. I worked at Kmart. I loved that car. Story 154. I was 19 when I bought my 10-year-old 1988 Honda Prelude after a summer of work for $1,700. Story 155. I turned 26 a few months ago. My partner and my dad contributed to the down payment, and I am financing the rest. It is a 2022 electric Corsa. Story 156. I bought a Porsche Boxster at age 26 after getting a job at Compaq. Story 157. I was about 24 or 25. I bought a used car after saving up and paid in cash. I would never finance a vehicle. To this day, I buy only what I can afford and pay in cash. Story 158. At 24, I bought a brand new 2014 Honda Civic. I was making $37,000 and living at home, so I chose a car within my budget that I knew would last me a long time. Story 159. It was a weird situation. My mom borrowed $2,500 to buy a small truck, and I had to pay her back. It went from surprise, here is your first car, to, oh, by the way, you owe us the money. I worked on a house doing construction and increased my hours at the grocery store to pay it off. I was still grateful. Now that I am older, it is kind of strange how that happened. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.